Hi guys, it's Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zickery of Space Command. And today, as part of my How to Write series, I'm going to be talking about how to pitch pilots, TV episodes, movies, books, basically anything that you want to write. And there's a real art to it, and I've, of course, have sold, hundreds of things, and TV scripts, pilots, movies, books, nonfiction and fiction. So we'll get into that, and essentially, and also, by the way, we have a Kickstarter campaign. It's got 3 days left to go. We're up to 75,000 to shoot the rest of Space Command Forgiveness. If we can top 100,000, that would go a long way toward really getting us going. We're already building sets, creatures, all sorts of stuff, costumes, looking for a space to rent to turn into a soundstage. So if you know a low-cost space in the Los Angeles area, that would be great. Or if you have a space and would like to donate it to us for a tax write-off, that would be great too. But meantime, if you can pledge to the Kickstarter campaign, spread the word, all that stuff, subscribe to Mr. Sci-Fi, ding the little bell below for notifications, all of that, that would be great. That would be appreciated. So let's talk about pitching. Now, of course, if you want a career as a professional writer, pitching is a vital skill to develop, because unless they hear what you want to write and they buy it, you don't get very far. And in another video soon, we'll talk about how to get in the door and how to get on their radar, because the rules you're told are not the real rules, and I mean the common wisdom, quote unquote. And in general, I reject what's called common wisdom, because that's usually the rules that most people follow that fail and are designed to fail. So query letters, all that kind of stuff, no. And in general. But and again, there's no absolute rules. So if you're a master at query letters and it's really worked for you, then keep doing query letters, absolutely. And but for most people, doing what the common advice is doesn't do anything. So okay, but let's get back to pitching. So the first step is, what legitimizes you? Why should they listen to your pitch? What makes you a real writer versus someone just with a notion who can't deliver it? Because again, when you're pitching a book or a TV episode or a pilot or a movie, the question they have in their mind, because everyone thinks it's about having a great idea. That's sometimes the case, but usually not. Usually they've got great ideas, coming out both ends, but it's about how you write the great idea, how you make it a great movie or a great TV show or a great book, because that's what people want to watch and read and buy. So the first question is, what legitimizes you? So generally with many things, I'll write the script before I pitch it, or I'll have enough to so that they can read it and go, wow, this is great, let's do this. And of course with Space Command, I'm just shooting it because I want to, because I really love getting the material out to you guys. It legitimizes the project. It's, and someone who responds to it as an executive will love it and want to put it on their VOD platform, etc. So, but okay. And also, obviously, the more, the greater the visibility of your partners, the better. So for instance, if it's Steven Spielberg or whomever coming in the room with you, then you might not have to have the script written because it's Steven Spielberg, for God's sake. But if it's just you writing the thing or building your own fan base via the podcast or a blog or a web series, is a great idea, because again, the more you've got people who love your work, the more people will pay attention. And but let's say minimally, you have a great idea, you learn how to write a script, you take classes, you do all that stuff, and the script is really solid, and then you manage to get the meeting. How do you pitch? Because let's say they've read the script, they still want to hear, if it's a TV show, where it goes from there, what you have in mind. And that's where you might want visuals, you might want to have laid out the first season of the show in brief. Here's the secrets. Here's some of the secrets of pitching. Know what the story is about at core. Know who your main characters are and what's important to them. Have your hero be the one with the most to lose or to gain, the one with the greatest amount at stake. So for instance, in Breaking Bad, he's dying of cancer and he wants to leave some legacy for his family, so he becomes a drug dealer, and then of course things get out of hand because he's got issues of wanting to be respected, and he becomes a monster. But initially, because he loves his family and he's going to die and leave them nothing, that's a strong incentive, and most people who are part of a family, and that's most of us, if not all of us, can identify with that. wanting to leave something behind for the people you love. And again, if he were just a sociopath who was not connected to anyone, that wouldn't be an engaging story. Even with Narcos, Pablo Escobar, who was a monster, they showed him as a loving husband and father. Whether or not he actually was, that remains to be seen. But for dramatic purposes, that's what they did. So so you go in, and usually there's a few minutes of chit chat. And again, there's many different places to pitch. They talk about the elevator pitch, where you're literally in an elevator and you've got like a minute. What would you say? The basic trick of all of this stuff, and there's many different ways to pitch, many different ways to succeed at pitching, but the basics are: have passion for your story, know what your story is, know who your characters are, and do not go into too much detail. That's a big mistake. So for instance, if you say, okay, we see our opening shot and it's day, and we see the sky, and we're panning down, and we're panning down, we're panning down, and we see the spire of a building, and we're panning down, and we see the 101st floor, and the 100th floor, and the 99th floor, and the 98th floor. Well, that's excruciating, of course. It's the Empire State Building. Okay, and there, it's like, no. It's like telling a good joke. You set it up, you tell what happens, you end with the punchline, and you're out. So it shouldn't take enormously long to pitch. It's not about every scene, it's not about every shot, ever. It's about what is the story, who are the characters, why should we care? Those are the main things. So if you're pitching a movie, it's beginning, middle, and end. But if you've written the script, you only need to pitch enough to get them intrigued enough to say, I want to read the script. So those are two different kinds of pitches. If you haven't written the script, then yes, you do have to pitch the beginning, middle, and end. Never be coy. If they say, well, how does it end? You never say, well, you'll have to buy it to find out, because that immediately means they won't buy it because they hate you. They want to know, okay? Additionally, you need to know what's important and what's not important in your story. So, because if the executive starts saying, well, does it have to be in Baltimore? Could it be in Philadelphia? You have to know what your bottom line is. So you say, well, yeah, it could be in Baltimore. Could it be a father and daughter instead of a mother and son? Well, okay, yes, it could be. Could it be about, a vigilante where he ends up the hero? Then you go, well, no, it can't. It's about a compassionate character, and I don't feel that this is a valid way of doing this story. You just have to know. There's not exactly a right or wrong answer. You just have to know, because if they're engaged and if they start coming up with suggestions or ideas, it means they're interested and they're rooting for you and they're trying generally to find a way to make this a potential sale. But you don't just agree to everything they say, because then, first of all, they know that you don't have any artistic integrity, and second, they want, it's like playing a tennis game where your partner isn't, doing anything. It's a back and forth. And the friendlier you can be, the warmer you can be, the more present you can be, all to the good. And basically, what I do is I usually start with, okay, this is the basics. You always start with what the genre is. This is an hour drama. This is a half-hour comedy. This is a 3-camera comedy or a 1-camera comedy. This is a mystery. This is, a love story. And then you say, basically, here's the basic notion. Okay, and then it's like, and then this is where it goes from there. And then they start asking questions, which is why you need to know a lot. It's like the iceberg where they see the little bit at the top, but there's a vast amount underneath. That's your research and your work. And you basically say, okay. So as they start asking questions, you know the answers. And if you don't know an answer, you say, well, that's a great question. Let me get back to you on that. Okay. But you shouldn't have that as your answer too much, because if it's just like, well, there's two guys, they walk into a bar, it's like, okay, well, is it Westworld? Is it Deadwood? Is it The Wire? What are we talking about? And if it's a comedy, you should say at least one or two things that make them laugh, because then they know that you can be funny, and that the story can be funny. If it's a drama, you don't obviously need to do that. But if you can move people, if you can move them to tears, if it's supposed to be something where the audience will be in tears, obviously if you can move an executive to tears, that's great. And if they ask, at the beginning of the meeting, they'll ask if you would like a beverage. You always say yes, because A, you'll be talking a lot and your mouth will get dry, and B, at least you got something. But also, the chit-chat at the beginning is just they're trying to see what kind of person you are, if you might be easy to work with. You want to be present. If you can research the executives beforehand to know what they're into and what they like. But again, don't go on too long. And if they say, okay, now what do you got? You don't keep talking. You go to the story. The point is, like, they're trying to gauge you, but then they want to hear what you're there for. And And so, and again, this is if you're in an official pitch meeting. If you're at a convention and you meet someone at a conference and they say, well, what are you working on? And you say, well, I'm working on this thing. It's a ghost story, and the ghost is a dog, and it's well, tell me more about that. That's cool. That's good. And so, and again, remember, if you say, I'm a brilliant writer, I'm a terrific writer, immediately where people's heads go to is bullshit. And so if you can say, well, I won the Oscar for Best Picture, and never lie, always say the truth, then it's like, well, maybe this guy can write, etc. So the question is, what legitimizes you? Who are your fans? Who believes in your work? And it shouldn't just be your mom. My mom thinks I'm terrific. Well, yeah, of course. So again, it's always about what's going to make them think that you have something on the ball, what's going to incline them towards saying yes. Now, but you always want to be, on your game, friendly, warm, articulate, brief. If they say, just give us the broad strokes, that means just what are the basics of the story, and whose story is it, and why do we care? Those are the basic questions. So hold on, I have to unleash my dogs, so I'm going to do that. I am out with the dogs. As you know, I do these commentaries often with the dogs, Rudy and Eve. Rudy and Eve, they're somewhere around here. There's Rudy, yeah, there he is. So, but, let's see, what else? Okay, so we talked about TV, movies, books, all that stuff. So let's go into the specifics of how they differ from one another in terms of pitching. It used to be that there were freelance slots, and that meant that you would go into an existing show. They really don't have those very much anymore, but the rules are the same if you're on staff, because you'd be pitching stories if you're on staff. It's knowing the characters, knowing what stories they've done, knowing what stories they've not done, knowing what stories they don't want to do. If you can have a conversation beforehand to get some specifics, that's helpful. The assistants can tell you, as well as the the writers and producers, and then you just kind of think, okay, what story would I love to see? What story would illuminate these characters in different and interesting ways that wouldn't violate the show, the basics of the show? Or it can be a novel, like if you're writing a Star Trek novel or Star Wars novel, just knowing what the rules are, what the guidelines are, and then but always try and figure out what's the story that you want to tell. What's the story that's of interest to you? Because if you're writing something, squeakball, if you're writing something that's not of interest to you, it's going to show, and it'll be boring to read or to watch. Whereas if you're writing a story that you do care about, the passion will come through if you do your job right. So for instance, so when I pitched to Star Trek, The Next Generation, or Deep Space Nine, or any of those shows back in the day, it was like, okay, then you'd have to inform yourself as to all the Star Trek stories to know what had been done, what had not been done. And then it was like, okay, what from my life am I interested in that I want to talk about through these characters? They become your spokespeople, but it's not to make a speech. It's not to be on a soapbox. It's basically, if it's basically a message like, you create the future by envisioning the future and standing for that future, things like that, then it's like, okay, this is a great way to tell the story, like in Far Beyond the Stars. But when you're on a show, or when you create a show, then it's like, okay, it's a big canvas. What do I want to do? Like with Space Command, it's like, Space Command is really fun because I know what the story of the first season is, but within that, I can be open to new ideas. So I meet, an actress whose work I like, or who I want to work with, and then it's like, here's how we could put her in the show. For instance, with Angelique Scott, we're casting her as Nathaniel Freeman's daughter. Nathaniel plays the chief engineer on the Paladin, and the story is 20 years later when she comes in, and so he's an older guy and he has a grown daughter. So that's really fun, and that helps us explore his character and hers in interesting ways. So we're shooting a scene with them on Saturday. And so Elaine and I are writing it, and then we start with the rehearsals with the actors, and then we talk to our costume people and line up a location to shoot, and a craftsman house, which will be Nathaniel's house, his character's house, Chilton. He plays Charlie Chilton, and named after the famous British science fiction writer of Journey into Space. And so with Space Command, I don't have to pitch to anyone other than when I'm trying to sell it. but I'm thinking about all the nooks and crannies and the ways of enlarging the story and cool visuals. But it always starts with what's the human story? What's the story I want to tell about children and parents and disappointment and redemption and all of those things, forgiveness. I've been titling the episodes, redemption's the first one, forgiveness is the second one because they're about that. Third one is the Great Solar War because I'm addressing the issue of war, but through the prism of our characters. So it's not in general, it's specific. So if you're creating your own show, let's say you're pitching a pilot, you can either write the pilot beforehand and lay out the show like we're doing with the Showrunners Network, where we're creating 6 series with Rockne O'Bannon and Mark Fergus and so forth. Or if let's say you already have a track record, or let's say you had a successful book or a successful movie or something that legitimizes you where they know you can write, then you go in and you say, okay, here's the basic idea for the show, here's who the main characters are, here's what happens in the pilot, and here's what happens in the season. Okay, and that's how it works. TV series are very different now because a season can tell an entire story, or individual episodes can tell stories, like the Orville versus Star Trek Discovery, where Star Trek Discovery is one story basically over a season, and and then the Orville tells different stories each episode. So that's some of it. So, and then in terms of pitching movies, again, you can pitch a movie, or you can just shoot a movie. I prefer the latter, frankly. But and then of course you have to think about how much is this movie going to cost. If it's like 2 characters in a cabin, that's less expensive. If it's a huge epic, either historical or science fiction, then if it's $100 or $200 million, there's very few places you can take it that have the money to be able to make that. So that limits your chances of selling it. In terms of books, if you've never written a book before, write it first, then try to sell it. Or you can put the chapters online. Again, it's the same thing. If you can gather the audience first, if you'd like, or you can, but going where the editors are. If you're a science fiction, fantasy, or horror writer, go to the World Science Fiction Convention, go to the World Fantasy Convention. That's where the editors go, the authors go, the agents go. Meet them in person. They're very friendly. They love books, and and also train. Go to the Clarion Writers Workshop. Really, treat the training seriously. Having a degree in writing will not get you a gig, but it will get you training. It will get you contacts with successful writers, hopefully. So essentially what I'm saying is that the first job of writing, of course, is to write. It's not to have a great idea. It's not to think, well, I'll just get in the room and I'll pitch this and I'll buy it and I'll be hired to write it and I'll earn millions. Gosh darn it. If it's just the idea, even, let's say for a moment it is a great idea, and you pitch it, they'll buy it for the least amount of money they can, and then they'll hire real writers to write it. So that's why you want to establish yourself as a real writer. And the way you establish yourself as a real writer is by writing, learning your craft, telling a story that thrills you and thrills others. And by the way, it's not about just writing stuff where you think it's great, because if you're alone in that opinion, then there's something wrong with the work, because the job of writing is not just to tell a story you want to tell. The job of writing is communicating that story, and the way you communicate it is by making sure that what you intend to say is what they're hearing. It's like a telephone call. If you were just talking and they couldn't hear you, that's not a successful telephone call. So, and the way you know if it's working is people are reading it, people love it, people want to know more, all of that stuff. So, so here's how you have this career in writing. You learn your craft, you write consistently. You go to conferences and conventions, you meet the executives, you meet the editors, you meet the agents. You basically, in the World Science Fiction Convention, the World Fantasy Convention, that's where you want to go if you want to sell books, particularly genre books. Book Expo America is the trade show for the publishing industry, and that's where all the publishers go. So if you want to see how the publishing industry works and perhaps meet some people who can be of use to you, that's where you go. Just staying at home, writing in your little bubble, not getting feedback, just assuming that your work is great, sending out query letters, calling agents, in Hollywood and getting their assistants who basically blow you off. This is not the way to succeed. Whereas if you go to conferences where the executives are, if you go to conventions where the editors are, if you, put aside a little money, have a yard sale, you put aside $1,000 or $2,000 so you can go to conventions, so you can go to conferences, so you can rent a hotel room. It's really worth the money. And because once you start selling, then you do have a career, then you do, have an income. And it's not about the single sale. It's about consistently writing material that's of meaning to you and to your audience, where they want to take the ride with you and you have a career that can last a lifetime. And so pitching, tell the story from your heart, be present, be clear, be brief, have answers to their questions, know where it's going. If it's a TV series, they want something that's going to run for year after year, ideally. But that can be where the story and the cast changes each year. That's what they refer to as an anthology now. In the old days, anthologies like Twilight Zone used to mean every episode was different. Now it means every season is different. But it would be within the genre, within the purview of the story, like American Horror Story or a True Detective. But beyond that, if you're pitching your own series, now you have the option of making it, just shooting it. And I strongly approve of that, because then you're actually creating the art. You know, pitching is an audition to do the job. When you're shooting when you're shooting a web series, shooting a short, shooting a feature, self-publishing even, with, like, for instance, with The Martian or 50 Shades of Grey, when that's actually doing the job. That's actually writing and getting it out to an audience. That's where film festivals can be very helpful. Television festivals, you can show spec pilots. And if something isn't good enough, if it doesn't work, get better. Affiliate with people who have talent. If you see the people that I bring aboard Space Command, you can see that whether they're famous or not, they're really good. They're really talented. And again, at science fiction conventions, you can meet the actors. And so if you want to do science fiction, that's a great thing too. Brandon Sanderson, who's a friend of mine, I had lunch with him a few years ago. He wrote 12 novels that didn't sell. And then from then on, everything he wrote sold. He writes 2 novels a year, one YA and one adult. And I said, what was different? And he said, I realized I was going to have to get out and meet people. And he started going to conventions and meeting the editors. And from then on, his work was golden, and he's now a very famous and very wealthy writer. The reason is, writers tend to be introspective. They tend to be shy. Not all of them, but most, because you're observers. We observe the world. Often there was a trauma in childhood, and it made us observant and hang back a bit. So as a result of that, being outgoing, being at cocktail parties and all of that stuff is not natural to us. But again, what you find is that if you start doing stuff, it becomes easier. You become more relaxed. I am actually a very shy person. I don't like going to those kind of things, but I recognize why I should do it and why it's good to do it. So, but the great part about being a writer when it succeeds is you get to have the life that you want. You get to tell the stories that only you can tell. It's really terrific, and your work lasts longer than you do, and lives beyond you. And so we all have writers whose work we love. So that's the basics of it. Also, the other thing is, when you're pitching a TV show, a movie, a book, graphic novels, all of that stuff, recognize you have to have the cornerstone. So don't say, oh, this can be all these different things. What's the main thing you want it to be? And then go with that. So for instance, if it's a TV series, don't say, well, this can be a TV series and a graphic novel and a movie and blah, 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 blah. They hear that all the time. It's like, what's the best medium for it, and how committed are you to that medium? And then, but also you can do graphic novels, you can do, shorts that then become larger things, etc. But kind of plant your feet and take your stand and have an opinion, and back it up with hard work. So that's some of it. If you have other questions about pitching, please, comment below, and go to our Kickstarter campaign, pledge to Space Command, subscribe to Mr. Sci-Fi. We also have a Patreon account if you want to ongoingly send me a little money to make this stuff possible. And, but beyond that, follow your dream, make it happen. It's up to you to carve that edifice, to sculpt that block of marble. And it's not up to anyone else, but if you do it, it's worth doing, and if you stick at it, you get better. And so that's sort of it for now. So subscribe to Mr. Sci-Fi, and we'll talk to you again really soon. Bye, guys.